Arizona Territory, spring of 1889. 6 feet tall with shoulders that could carry a horse, she stood at the edge of Redemption Valley like a monument carved from stone. Not a woman the frontier had known how to classify. Not a wife, not a servant, not property. Just a force that had decided she belonged to no one. The men who'd tried to claim her were still talking about it in saloons 3 territories over. Some said she'd broken a man's arm with her bare hands. Others swore she could track a ghost through a sandstorm and drag it back to face judgment. But the truth that made her truly frightening was simpler. She'd learned to survive in a world that had promised her she wouldn't, and she'd decided that survival wasn't enough anymore. She wanted to choose. She wanted to matter. She wanted a man who could stand next to her without flinching. Then one autumn morning, when she'd nearly stopped believing such a man existed, a stranger rode into Redemption Valley. He didn't know who she was, didn't know her reputation or her history. And that's exactly what changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Redemption Valley had earned its name from wishful thinking, rather than any actual redemption that had occurred there. It sat in a high desert basin where Colorado blue spruce met scrubland, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a dry creek bed that only ran with water 3 months out of the year. The main street was wide enough for a wagon and a prayer, lined with storefronts that had seen better days. A general store with shelves that held more dust than merchandise. A saloon where the whiskey was cheaper than the company. A blacksmith's forge that rang out at irregular intervals, depending on whether the smith was sober enough to work. At the far end of town, where civilization gave way to open land, stood a structure that didn't quite fit the pattern of the other buildings. It was older, built with careful attention to detail that suggested someone had once believed this place deserved care. Stone foundation, timber frame, a pitched roof that wouldn't collect water during the rare desert storms. A modest ranch house, the kind a man might build if he was staying, and meant to stay well. But it was who lived there that made Redemption Valley different from the dozens of other forgotten towns scattered across the territory. Her name was Catherine Whitmore, though most people in town never used it. They called her Kate when she was close enough to hear. When she wasn't, they called her other things. The half-breed, the giant, the woman who wouldn't break. Her father had been a cavalry officer who'd arrived in Arizona with orders and ambition. Her mother had been Apache from the Chiricahua band, captured in a raid and resigned to a life that was neither one world nor the other. Catherine had been born into that impossible space, belonging fully to neither the frontier, society that produced her father, nor the tribal traditions that ran through her mother's blood. What she'd inherited from both was an absolute refusal to be less than she was. She was indeed tall, nearly 6 feet, which put her eye level with most men, and taller than many. Her shoulders were broad, built lean and strong, from years of ranch work that demanded everything. Her skin was darker than white, not quite as dark as full Apache, a color that marked her as something else entirely. Her hair, black and thick, she wore in a single braid that fell halfway down her back, practical and unadorned. Her eyes were the strangest part of her, dark brown, with flecks of amber that seemed to catch light in an unsettling way, giving her an appearance of perpetual assessment, as if she was always calculating distances and weaknesses. She'd never married, never intended to. The men who came to Redemption Valley with romantic notions learned quickly that Catherine Whitmore wasn't interested in being charmed or courted or claimed. She ran her ranch efficiently, hired capable hands who respected her authority, and moved through town with the kind of quiet purpose that made people uncomfortable. Not hostile, not angry, just utterly indifferent to approval or acceptance. There was a story, several stories, actually, about how this attitude had solidified into something permanent. 7 years back, a cavalry officer from Fort Huachuca had come to town with leave, and his sights set on proving he could handle a woman like Catherine. He was handsome in the way men with nothing to prove usually are, confident that his uniform and his pedigree would overcome any resistance. He'd approached her at the general store, all charm and presumption. She'd listened to his entire proposition without interrupting, then looked him directly in the eye and told him that she'd rather die than spend an hour in his company, let alone a lifetime. When he persisted, showing up at her ranch, sending letters, making a scene in the saloon, Catherine had invited him out to her land. They'd ridden together to a ravine several miles from town. She'd made him dismount, shown him the drop, and asked if he understood what she was telling him, that some women were not acquisitions, that some women were not softened by persistence, that some women would choose a cliff over a lifetime of being less than themselves. He'd ridden back to town and left on the next supply wagon. Then there was the incident with Marcus Thorne, a wealthy rancher from New Mexico who'd heard about the half-breed woman and decided she represented a challenge worth pursuing. He'd arrived with money, confidence, and the assumption that everything had a price. Catherine had worked with him for a full week, leading him deeper into her land, showing him the terrain and the challenges of ranching in such harsh conditions. On the 8th day, she'd left him in the desert 12 miles from town with one canteen and directions that required him to actually think and work his way back. He'd made it, barely. He'd also never returned. The men of Redemption Valley had learned. Catherine Whitmore was not a woman to be pursued or won or changed. She was a woman who existed on her own terms, and anyone who couldn't accept those terms could find a woman elsewhere. And so the years had accumulated. She was 32 years old now, independent, capable, and entirely alone by choice. She'd made peace with this, or so she'd convinced herself. The truth, which she kept carefully locked away from examination, was that loneliness was not the same as solitude. Loneliness required the memory of connection. Solitude was simply the absence of it. She had chosen solitude, and in that choice, she'd built a life that worked, even if it didn't quite fit the shape of what she'd once imagined for herself in the younger years before. Disappointment had taught her that desire and reality rarely aligned. She kept her ranch with meticulous attention. The house was clean, well-maintained, the furniture sparse but functional. She had a small library of books, a luxury in the territory, filled with novels and histories and practical guides to animal husbandry. She had horses well-trained and responsive. She had cattle healthy and productive. She had water, which was more valuable than gold in this landscape. Everything a person needed to thrive, without requiring another person to complete the picture. In the mornings, she rose with the sun and moved through her work with efficient grace. She could rope and brand and break a horse. She could shoot straight enough to keep predators away from her stock and feed herself if the stores failed. She could read the weather in the way the light bent through dust and the angle of the bird's flight. She was, in every measurable way, a complete unit unto herself. But there was a restlessness that had begun to creep in over the past year, a dissatisfaction that had nothing to do with her circumstances and everything to do with the particular kind of loneliness that comes from choosing solitude as a defense against inevitable disappointment. She'd built walls against the world, and they'd protected her. But protection, she was beginning to understand, was just another word for limitation. It was on a morning in late autumn when everything shifted, though she didn't recognize it at first as a shift. She was checking the northern fence line, moving along the border of her property on horseback, evaluating damage from the previous week's wind. The fence was holding better than she'd expected. A few loose posts, some wire that needed tightening, but nothing catastrophic. She was so focused on the work that she almost didn't notice the stranger until his horse crossed into her visible range. He was riding from the northwest, moving slowly, deliberately, his horse picking its way carefully across rocky terrain. He was lean, not particularly tall, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent under sun and open sky. He rode with the easy competence of someone who'd spent significant time in the saddle. But there was something else in his posture, a careful awareness of the land around him that suggested he was reading it, not just moving through it as he got closer. She noticed he had a rifle, though it wasn't drawn, a bedroll tied to his saddle. A man traveling with purpose, not wandering aimlessly. She didn't hide. Hiding wasn't her way. She simply sat on her horse and waited, watching as he approached. He saw her and changed his trajectory slightly, heading directly toward her rather than continuing northwest. When he was close enough to speak without shouting, he pulled up and tipped his hat, a gesture so old-fashioned it seemed almost quaint. "Morning, Mom. I'm looking for Redemption Valley, wondering if you could point me toward town." He saw her and changed his trajectory slightly, heading directly toward her rather than continuing northwest. When he was close enough to speak without shouting, he pulled up and tipped his hat, a gesture so old-fashioned it seemed almost quaint. "Morning, Mom. I'm looking for Redemption Valley, wondering if you could point me toward town." His voice was rough, unpolished but not unfriendly. His eyes, when she met them, held curiosity without judgment. He was studying her the way she'd been studying him, taking in the detail of her appearance without the usual flash of confusion or discomfort that most men showed when confronted with someone as categorically undefined as she. "You're riding directly toward it," she said, her own voice steady and unadorned. "Another mile north, you'll hit the main street." Much obliged. He didn't immediately turn his horse away. Instead, he seemed to be considering something. "You live around here?" "That would be obvious." She gestured to the fence line, to the clearly marked property. "Unless you thought I was just standing in the desert for entertainment." He smiled at that, a real smile that reached his eyes. "No, ma'am. I reckon you weren't standing here for no good reason. I'm looking for work, actually. Heard in a town about 50 miles south that Redemption Valley had ranches that needed capable hands. Thought I might ask around." She studied him more carefully now. He had the look of a man who knew ranch work, hands calloused in the right places, shoulders built from labor rather than vanity, a certain economy of movement that suggested competence without the need for display. But he also had the look of a man who'd been traveling hard, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he was traveling away from something as much as traveling toward anything. "The saloon would be your best place to start," she said. "They keep track of who needs work in these parts." "I appreciate that." He adjusted his hat, preparing to move on. Then he paused. "I didn't catch your name, ma'am." She considered not answering. She considered giving a false name, but something in the straightforward way he was looking at her, with genuine curiosity and no presumption, made her answer honestly. "Catherine Whitmore." He nodded slowly, as if filing the name away. "Thomas Bailey. If you hear of any work that might suit me, steady work, not just day labor, would there be a way to leave word for me at the saloon? I might have need for an extra hand in the spring," she heard herself say. "If you're still in the territory and still looking for work, come back this way." It was a non-committal offer, the kind of thing she said to people all the time without meaning anything by it. But as she said it, she found herself genuinely wondering if he would return, if he was the type of man who followed through on possibilities or simply drifted through the territory, picking up work where it appeared. "Never staying long enough to matter. I'll do that," he said. "Spring, then." "Thank you, Miss Whitmore." He tipped his hat again and turned his horse toward town. She watched him ride away, noting the confident seat, the way he moved with the horse rather than against it, the straightness of his spine that suggested a man who had nothing to prove, and therefore didn't need to prove it. Then she turned her attention back to the fence, pushing away the unexpected sensation of curiosity that had bloomed in her chest. It was nothing, she told herself. A stranger passing through. There was no reason to think about him beyond the moment of their meeting. There was no reason to expect he would actually return, and yet, as winter came and the year turned again toward spring, Catherine found herself unable to completely stop thinking about the calm certainty in his eyes and the way he'd looked at her, as if what he saw was simply a woman doing work, not a problem requiring solving. It was a small thing, and therefore dangerous, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Winter came early to the territory that year, the temperature dropping faster than the weathermen predicted, catching ranchers unprepared. Snow fell in November, unusual for Redemption Valley, and it fell heavy, not the light dustings that occasionally blessed the high desert, but real snow that accumulated and stayed. Catherine found herself working longer days, ensuring her stock had shelter and feed, riding out in conditions that most people would have considered prohibitive to check on vulnerable animals. The work was relentless, the kind that consumed every hour of daylight and then some, leaving her too exhausted to think about much of anything beyond the immediate demands of survival. Which was, she recognized distantly, probably why she'd remembered to think about Thomas Bailey at all. There wasn't room in her mind for speculation or curiosity when every waking moment required her full attention. By mid-December, the snow had piled high enough that travel became genuinely difficult. The supply wagons from the larger towns came less frequently. The saloon in Redemption Valley saw fewer faces. People stayed close to home, preserving resources and avoiding the kind of risks that the season invited. It was a quieter version of the territory, communities turning inward, families huddling together against the cold. Catherine worked alone, as she always did, and the isolation felt more pronounced than it had in previous winters. Perhaps because she'd been foolish enough to mention spring work to a stranger who almost certainly wouldn't remember her or his casual commitment. Perhaps because she'd spent the autumn months, however unconsciously, thinking about whether he might actually return. Perhaps because the weight of winter, the long dark hours and the relentless cold, made her aware of her solitude in a way that the busy seasons never did. It was during a particularly brutal stretch, when 3 days of continuous snow had made riding impossible and visibility from the ranch windows was reduced to a few yards, that Catherine took inventory of her supplies and realized she had a problem. The flour would run out before spring. She'd miscalculated somewhere, perhaps used more in the fall than she'd accounted for, perhaps hadn't tracked the usage as carefully as she should have. The error was small but meaningful. Without flour, without the bread and biscuits it provided, other stores wouldn't stretch as far. There were options. She could ride into town, though the snow made it dangerous and slow. She could send word to the general store and have them reserve supplies for her. She could ration what she had left and simply make do with less. It was the last option that rankled her pride, though she tried to frame it as simple practicality. Catherine Whitmore didn't ask for help. Catherine Whitmore didn't make mistakes that required correction by others, but Catherine Whitmore was also not foolish enough to starve herself out of pride. The day she decided to ride into town was a day of marginal improvement in the weather. The snow had stopped falling, and while the ground remained white and treacherous, the sky had cleared enough that she could see the distant mountains. It wasn't good conditions for riding, but it was as good as it had been in days, and she'd already delayed long enough. She prepared her horse with practiced efficiency, saddling and bridling the animal with sure hands, securing a saddlebag for carrying supplies back. She wore layers, a wool vest beneath her jacket, thick gloves, a hat pulled low. The cold was the kind that burned exposed skin after a few minutes, and she'd learned long ago the consequences of underestimating how quickly the territory could turn hostile. The ride into town took longer than usual, the snow making the horse careful and cautious. Catherine let the animal set the pace, trusting its instinct about where the ground was solid enough to trust. The landscape was transformed by the snow, made unfamiliar and beautiful in a way the territory rarely was. The harsh edges softened, the browns and tans replaced by whites and pale blues. It would have been peaceful if she weren't acutely aware of the danger underneath. Redemption Valley looked smaller under snow. The buildings huddled together as if for warmth. Smoke rose from several chimneys. Horses were tethered outside the saloon despite the cold. Catherine tied her horse to the post outside the general store and entered, brushing snow from her shoulders. The store was warm, heated by a stove in the corner. The proprietor, a man named Edmund Price, who'd owned the store for 15 years, looked up from his ledger with the expression of mild surprise. "Catherine, didn't expect to see you in this weather. Need flour," she said simply. "And salt if you have extra. My stores are lower than anticipated." Edmund nodded, moving toward the shelves where flour was kept in large cloth sacks. He began gathering what she needed, measuring it out and setting it on the counter. "Weather like this plays havoc with planning," he said conversationally. "Even experienced folks miscalculate. Nothing to feel poorly about." She didn't respond to the reassurance because she didn't feel poorly about miscalculating. She felt annoyed, which was different. Annoyance was productive. It suggested something to correct. Feeling poorly suggested self-pity, and she'd never had much use for that. "Anything else?" Edmund asked, wrapping the flour in brown paper with practiced efficiency. "Coffee. And tobacco if you have it from the good supplier." Edmund laughed. "The good supplier is 50 miles away most of the time. But I've got something reasonable." He began gathering the additional items, his movements easy and familiar. Then he paused, looking toward the back room. "Oh, you might be interested to know we've got a new hand in town. Been asking about work, saying he'd been hired on for the spring with someone in the territory, but wasn't sure exactly where. Seemed to think the person had mentioned having a ranch, but didn't remember the exact details." Catherine's hand, which had been reaching for the coffee Edmund was offering, stilled for just a moment. She completed the motion without changing her expression. "Is that so?" "Staying at the rooming house," Edmund continued, apparently oblivious to or choosing to ignore her carefully controlled tone. "Seems like good people. Quiet, capable. The kind that does work without needing constant supervision. If you've got work come spring, might be worth remembering him. Seemed solid. What's his name?" Catherine asked, and she was proud that her voice remained level and practical. "Thomas Bailey. He was in here a couple weeks back, right before the big snow hit. Seemed surprised when I mentioned you owned that ranch to the north. Asked if you were the tall woman he'd met on the road back in autumn." There was absolutely no reason for her heart to accelerate at this information. Absolutely no reason for her breathing to change, or for the small flame of something that might have been hope to kindle in her chest. It was ridiculous, the kind of adolescent response to a man's mere existence that she'd thought herself long past. And yet there it was, impossible to deny or dismiss. "I might check on that," she said carefully. "Come spring, as we discussed," Edmund smiled knowingly, the way older men sometimes did when they thought they understood something about other people's lives better than those people understood themselves. Catherine paid for her supplies, declined his offer of coffee inside the store's warmth, and stepped back out into the cold. The snow crunched beneath her boots. The air was so cold it made her lungs burn when she breathed. She loaded the flour and supplies onto her horse with methodical precision, taking her time, thinking about the information Edmund had provided, while trying very hard not to think about the information Edmund had provided. Thomas Bailey had remembered her, or he'd remembered the ranch, or the direction, or enough details to ask questions about a tall woman. He'd been detailed enough in his inquiries to suggest it hadn't been casual curiosity. And he was waiting through the winter, staying in Redemption Valley, maintaining his willingness to work for her come spring. It was the kind of thing that a practical woman had no business reading too much into. He was looking for work. She'd mentioned possibly having work. He was taking her at her word. There was nothing personal in it, nothing that suggested anything beyond basic professionalism and the practical need for employment. And yet, she climbed onto her horse and began the ride back to her ranch, her mind churning in ways she didn't particularly welcome. The snow continued to fall lightly as she rode, not the heavy accumulation of the storm, just gentle flakes that didn't seem to be sticking. She rode carefully, aware of the horse's fatigue, aware of her own exhaustion from the work and the cold. When she reached her property, the sun was already low on the horizon, the light taking on that particular quality it had before winter twilight. The ranch house appeared in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney where she'd banked the fire that morning. It looked welcoming in a way it rarely did, warm and solid against the white landscape. She unsaddled the horse and rubbed it down, got it into the shelter of the barn with hay and water. Then she carried the supplies inside, setting them carefully in the storage area she designated for provisions. The flour was safe now. The small crisis was averted, but as she prepared her dinner, simple beans and hardtack, made slightly less austere by the coffee, Catherine found her thoughts returning to Edmund's casual revelation with the persistence of a dog at a bone. Thomas Bailey had asked about her. Thomas Bailey had remembered enough details to make inquiries. Thomas Bailey was still here in Redemption Valley, waiting through the cold months, the flame that had kindled in her chest when she heard this information. The small, dangerous flame of hope refused to be extinguished by practicality or reason. She sat by the fire that night, nursing her coffee, and allowed herself to consider a possibility she'd thought she'd moved beyond. That perhaps there were men in the world who weren't intimidated by a woman's strength. That perhaps there was someone who could stand beside her without needing her to diminish herself. That perhaps the years of choosing solitude as protection didn't have to be permanent. It was a dangerous thought, more dangerous than snow or cold or any of the practical threats that the territory offered. Because hope, once kindled, was remarkably difficult to extinguish. And Catherine Whitmore had spent too many years learning not to hope for things she couldn't control. But spring was coming. The snow would melt. And when it did, Thomas Bailey would either prove to be a man of his word, or he would prove to be just another drifter. Forgotten by morning, she had 5 months to prepare herself for either outcome. Spring in the territory came like a switch flipping. One day the world was frozen, snow clinging to every surface, life reduced to survival. The next day, the snow was melting into rivers, the grass pushing through in desperate green, the birds returning with their insistent songs. The transition happened over a span of perhaps 2 weeks, a brief window where winter surrendered to warmth before summer's heat arrived to claim the land. Catherine marked the arrival of spring by the condition of her fences and the health of her newborn calves. The winter had been hard on the livestock, not catastrophic but demanding. She'd lost 3 cattle to cold and age, which was acceptable losses, but still represented resources gone to waste. The calves that had been born in late winter and early spring were small and delicate, requiring careful monitoring to ensure they didn't fall behind in their growth or succumb to the diseases that sometimes swept through young animals in seasonal transitions. By the first week of May, when the worst of the cold had definitely passed and the territory was warming into something genuinely pleasant, Catherine had convinced herself that Thomas Bailey would not return. It had been 6 months since their encounter on the fence line. 6 months was an eternity in the territory, time enough for a man to get hired elsewhere, to follow other opportunities, to forget a casual promise made to a stranger on the road. She'd prepared herself for his absence with the same methodical attention she gave to any necessary planning. She would hire someone else if she needed to hire anyone at all. She would manage as she always managed. The work of spring was relentless, even with this prepared acceptance of his likely non-arrival. Fences required extensive repair after the winter. Calves needed branding and tagging. Water sources needed clearing of debris. The fields where she rotated her cattle needed inspection for erosion and damage. She rose before dawn and worked until the light failed. The kind of schedule that left no time for contemplation or wondering about men who'd promised to return, but almost certainly wouldn't. It was on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks into May, when she was riding the western boundary, checking the condition of a critical water source, that she saw the dust in the distance, a rider moving at an easy pace from the direction of Redemption Valley. Catherine's first assumption was that it was someone from town bringing a message. Edmund Price occasionally sent his son with supplies or information for ranchers in the outlying areas. But something about the way the rider was moving, with purpose rather than the wandering pace of someone on an errand, made her reconsider. She adjusted her course slightly, angling toward the approaching rider rather than away. As the figure got closer, details resolved themselves. A lean man on a solid horse, wearing clothes that had seen wear but were carefully maintained. A bedroll tied to the saddle. The rider pulled up about 20 yards away, and Catherine recognized him with a sensation that was equal parts relief and panic. Thomas Bailey looked older than he had in autumn. Not aged, but weathered further by months of hard work and exposure. His face was darker from sun, his hands calloused in new patterns. He sat the horse with easy confidence, surveying her with the same steady assessment she remembered from their first meeting. "Miss Whitmore," he said, tipping his hat. "I told you I'd come back spring." There was no apparent doubt in his voice that she would remember him, would remember the promise, would still have work available. It was the confidence of a man who wasn't used to being forgotten or left behind. "You did say that," Catherine replied, keeping her own voice carefully neutral. She'd prepared a response to this scenario, or thought she had. But the actual reality of him standing before her, real and tangible rather than a thought she could control, made the preparation seem inadequate. "You're late." "Spring arrived 3 weeks ago. Weather held me up south," he said simply. "Got delayed helping a family with a broken wagon. Couldn't leave them without making sure they'd be safe. Lost a week because of it." It was such an ordinary explanation, so matter-of-fact in its description of compassion, that Catherine didn't immediately have a response. She'd expected excuses, not honesty, about the kind of decision that would cause a man to be late for work. "Are you saying you had employment lined up and delayed it to help strangers?" she asked, because she needed to understand what kind of man made those choices. "Something like that," he said. "Woman's husband was badly injured. Children were scared. Didn't feel right to ride off and leave them to figure it out alone. Figured someone hiring in spring would understand a man making that choice." Catherine studied him for a long moment. Behind him, the desert stretched out in its spring colors, the greens of new growth, the browns of rock and sand, the impossibly blue sky. The wind moved through the scrubland, carrying the scent of sage and earth. It was a landscape that didn't tolerate softness or unnecessary sentiment. And yet this man had apparently allowed sentiment to delay him, had apparently chosen to help without guarantee of reward or even thanks. "I might have work for you," she said carefully. "But I need to know if you understand what working here means. It's hard work, poor soil, difficult animals, and isolation. I work alone most of the time, and I don't tolerate laziness or incompetence. If you can't keep up, or if you're the type to quit when things get difficult, tell me now, and we don't waste each other's time." Thomas nodded slowly, as if he'd expected her to have conditions, and was pleased that she'd stated them clearly. "I understand. I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for honest work with honest pay, and someone who doesn't ask me to be less than I am. If that's what you're offering, then I'm interested." The answer was so precisely calibrated to what she needed to hear that Catherine felt something shift in her chest. Not trust exactly. Trust was something that required time, but a lessening of her habitual defensive tension. "I'll need to see you work before I commit to anything permanent," she said. "But I have fence repairs that need doing, and some clearing work in the south pasture. We can start with that. If you prove capable, we'll talk about longer arrangements." "Fair enough," he said. She gestured for him to follow and turned her horse toward the ranch. Behind her, she heard him clicking to his horse, heard the hoofbeats falling into rhythm with her own. For the first time in a very long time, she wasn't completely alone on her land. The sensation was strange, neither entirely welcome nor entirely unwelcome, simply different. The ranch house came into view as they rode down the slope. Thomas looked at it with obvious appreciation, taking in the careful construction, the maintained condition, the obvious effort that had gone into maintaining a quality structure in such harsh conditions. "You built this yourself?" he asked. "My father helped with the foundation and major work," Catherine said. "But mostly, yes. It needed to be built right, or it needed to not be built at all." "Shows," Thomas said simply. "A quality work." She showed him to the small outbuilding that served as workers' quarters, a practical space with a bed, a storage chest, and a small stove for heating. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and solid and dry. Thomas set his bedroll down and looked around with the air of a man who was accustomed to much less. "This will do fine," he said. "When do you want me to start?" "Tomorrow, dawn," Catherine said. "I'll show you the fence sections that need repair. I'll provide meals. You can eat at the house. Water and basic supplies are available. If you need anything else, you can ask, but I don't stock luxuries." "I don't need luxuries," Thomas said. He set his saddle down carefully. "I need honest work and a fair chance. That's all I've ever needed." Catherine nodded, feeling something in her settle into place, though she couldn't have named what. She left him to settle and rode back toward the house, aware of a change in her own demeanor that she didn't particularly welcome or understand. The careful control she'd maintained, the walls she'd built to protect herself from disappointment, they felt less solid than they had that morning. That evening, as she prepared dinner, she found herself cooking more than she usually did. Extra biscuits, coffee, instead of the weaker tea she often settled for, vegetables that required more effort to prepare. She told herself it was simply professional hospitality, the kind of thing any employer would offer a new employee. But even as she thought it, she knew she was lying to herself. There was something else happening, something that had to do with spring and hope, and the dangerous possibility that a stranger could become something more than a stranger. When Thomas arrived at the house for dinner, he ate with the quiet, unself-conscious appetite of a man who was genuinely hungry but didn't make a display of it. He thanked her for the meal without fawning over it, accepted seconds when she offered, and excused himself without lingering awkwardly. It was the kind of perfect calibration of behavior that suggested someone who understood boundaries and respected them. After he left, Catherine stood alone in her kitchen, looking at the dishes that needed washing, and found herself smiling faintly. Tomorrow he would work, and she would be able to see what kind of employee he was, what his capabilities actually were beyond the brief interactions they'd had. Tomorrow would reveal whether his promises were backed by competence and follow-through. But tonight, for the first time in months, perhaps for the first time in years, Catherine allowed herself to feel the small, dangerous sensation of anticipation about what spring might actually bring. The first week of Thomas Bailey's employment revealed what Catherine had suspected, but not confirmed. He was genuinely capable. Not just competent in the way that most ranch hands were, but genuinely skilled at reading a problem and solving it with minimal supervision. He understood fence work intuitively, knowing where wire would hold and where it would fail, how to position posts for maximum stability in soil that resisted deep anchoring. He worked steadily, without the performative displays of effort that some men made to prove their worth. Simply worked. Catherine observed him carefully during that first week, watching from her own tasks for signs of the usual shortcomings. Men often had a tendency toward cutting corners when they thought no one was looking, or towards slowness that appeared only when the employer's attention was diverted. But Thomas seemed to work the same way, whether Catherine was watching or whether she was a quarter-mile away, tending to other business. The quality remained consistent. The pace remained steady. By the end of the second week, she was already considering asking him to stay on permanently, rather than keeping the arrangement temporary, as she'd initially suggested. It was a significant step, moving from "we'll see how this works" to genuine employment commitment. It meant building expectations. It meant assuming he wouldn't leave. It meant creating a pattern of companionship that extended beyond the purely transactional. The work itself created natural opportunities for interaction. Repairing fence was a two-person job when done efficiently. One person positioning wire while another held tension, both of them working in coordination. Catherine found that she and Thomas had begun developing an unspoken rhythm, understanding each other's movements without needing to communicate verbally. It was the kind of coordination that developed through hours of repetition and attention. It was during one of these work sessions in the middle of the third week that Thomas first asked her a personal question that went beyond the immediate practicalities of the work. They were repairing a section of fence on the eastern boundary, the morning warm but not yet hot. Thomas was holding tension on a particularly difficult wire while Catherine positioned the bracket. As they worked, he spoke without looking away from his task. "How long have you been running this ranch alone?" Catherine considered whether to answer. It wasn't an invasive question, not exactly. But it was the first time he'd asked her anything about her life that wasn't directly related to work. 14 years, she said finally. "Since my father died." "That's a long time to be doing everything yourself." "I'm capable," Catherine said. "Not defensively, but as a statement of fact." "I didn't say you weren't," Thomas replied. He adjusted the tension on the wire as she repositioned the bracket. "I just said it's a long time. Doesn't require incapability to be hard." There was something in the way he said it, not sympathetic exactly, but acknowledging. That made Catherine continue speaking, which was not her usual pattern. "My mother passed when I was young. My father tried to run the ranch and raise me, but he wasn't particularly suited to either task individually. When he died, there wasn't anyone else to do it, so I did it." She set the bracket in place, and Thomas released the tension gradually, checking the hold. "It was secure. Did he teach you before he died?" "Some," Catherine said. "Mostly I learned by doing and by observing. There's a lot of documentation in ranching guides, a lot of trial and error." They moved to the next section of fence that needed attention. This one was better preserved. Only a short section of wire needed replacement. Thomas began removing the old wire while Catherine prepared the new. "I never knew my father," Thomas said conversationally. "My mother raised me alone in Denver. She took in sewing work, did whatever needed doing to keep us fed. She was the strongest person I ever met, but it exhausted her. By the time I was old enough to actually help, she was already worn down. Died when I was 22. It was the first genuinely personal information Thomas had shared, and Catherine recognized it as a kind of exchange, a matching of her vulnerability with his own. "I'm sorry," Catherine said. "And meant it. So am I," Thomas said simply. "But she taught me something important before she died. She said that strength isn't about never needing help. It's about being willing to accept help when it's offered, and being willing to offer help when someone else needs it. She said refusing help because you're capable of doing everything alone is just another kind of weakness. Pride masquerading as strength." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, considering the words. They struck something in her that she didn't particularly want struck. Exposed some truth about her own choices that she'd been carefully not examining. "That's a complicated philosophy," she said finally. "It is," Thomas agreed. "But it's true, I think." They worked in silence for a while after that, but it was a different quality of silence than the companionable quiet they'd developed through shared labor. This was a silence filled with the weight of revelation and reflection. The fourth week brought a different kind of test. A group of cattle in the south pasture developed a respiratory illness, a sickness that swept through herds occasionally, sometimes devastating, sometimes manageable. Catherine identified it early. She'd seen it before, recognized the symptoms in a sick calf that one of the ranch hands would have missed. The question was how to manage it before the illness spread to the rest of her stock. It required constant attention, checking on affected animals, isolating the sickest ones, providing extra feed and water, administering basic treatments with limited veterinary resources. It was physically demanding and emotionally draining, the kind of work that required someone to care about the animals beyond their monetary value. Catherine expected Thomas to do the basic work required, but to maintain professional distance from the situation. Instead, she found him treating the care of the sick animals with the same meticulous attention he gave to fence repair. He noticed details, a calf's breathing pattern changing, a cow's appetite shifting, that suggested attention far beyond what was necessary for a hired hand. On the fifth night of the illness crisis, Catherine found Thomas sleeping in the barn, having stayed through the night to monitor a particularly sick heifer. She had done the same thing, managing a few hours of sleep in the house before returning to check conditions. Finding him there in the straw, his face lined with exhaustion, but his expression peaceful despite the circumstances. Something shifted in her understanding of who he was. When the heifer recovered, limped back to health over the course of a week, both of them understood that the recovery had required his intervention as much as hers. He didn't make a display of it or expect thanks, simply accepted it as part of what the work demanded. It was during this recovery period, when the immediate crisis had passed but vigilance was still required, that Catherine found herself making a decision she hadn't consciously planned. "I'd like to offer you permanent work," she said to him one evening as they sat outside, watching the sun set. "Not seasonal, not temporary, permanent. I'll pay you fairly, provide room and board, and you'll have half days off to do what you choose." Thomas looked at her for a long moment before responding. "Why?" "Because you've proven yourself capable. Because you work the way I believe work should be done. Because you've stayed when most people wouldn't. That's practical reasoning," Thomas said. "That's not really why, though." Catherine was quiet. He was right. There was a deeper reason, something she wasn't quite ready to articulate. "Because I don't want you to leave," she said finally. And the admission cost her something. Some piece of the careful control she'd maintained over her own heart. Thomas nodded slowly. "Then I accept, not just for the work, but because I don't want to leave either. I came back spring like I promised. I've worked because I'm capable. But if I'm being honest, Catherine, I stayed because of you. Because something about you made me want to see if this could become something more than just employment." Catherine's breath caught. This was the moment where she could retreat, could rebuild her walls, could make it clear that this was about practicality and nothing more. She could protect herself, the way she'd protected herself for so many years. Instead, she looked at the man beside her, weathered, honest, bearing his own history of loss and survival, and allowed herself to consider the possibility that her mother had been wrong when she taught Catherine that survival required solitude. That perhaps there was a different kind of strength in allowing someone to stand beside you. The summer unfolded with a rhythm that Catherine had thought belonged only to solitude, but which now included another person in its pattern. Thomas moved through the days with an ease that suggested he'd always been part of the landscape, always belonged to the work and the land. There were moments when Catherine would look up from her task and see him working in the distance, repairing a section of barn roof, moving cattle from one pasture to another, breaking a young horse, and feel a sense of rightness that she didn't want to examine too closely. They had not kissed, had not made any kind of physical commitment beyond the occasional touch that had become natural between people who worked closely, his hand steadying her arm when she was climbing down from a horse, her shoulder brushing his as they stood side by side, reviewing ranch plans by lamplight. It was a kind of courtship that Catherine supposed was unusual, built on work and trust, rather than the performative romanticism that most courtships seemed to require. But the deeper they moved into summer, the more Catherine found herself aware of a silence between them that she couldn't ignore. Thomas had shared fragments of his past. Catherine had shared fragments of hers. But neither of them had shared the significant parts, the stories that had shaped them into who they'd become. Catherine understood, on some level, that this avoidance couldn't continue indefinitely, that Thomas would eventually ask, and that she would have to decide whether to tell him the truth or lose him through omission. The moment came in late July, during a period of intense heat that made the afternoons unbearable. The sun pressed down so heavily that cattle moved only to water and shade. Work slowed, tasks being done in early morning and late evening. The middle of the day left to rest and preparation for the next cycle of heat. It was during one of these sweltering afternoons that Thomas found Catherine sitting on the porch, a notebook in her lap, staring out at the shimmering heat rising from the ground. She'd been tracking expenses, a task that never felt particularly rewarding, but was necessary for any ranch to operate sustainably. Thomas sat down beside her without asking permission, which had become his way. Not presumptuous, simply present. "You've never told me about your mother," he said without preamble. "You mentioned she was Apache, but that's all. Everything else is silence." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. The choice was upon her. She could deflect, could suggest the topic was unnecessary or unwelcome. She could maintain the careful boundaries she'd constructed around her past. "She was taken," Catherine said finally, "in a raid when she was 17, brought to a military fort where my father was stationed. He was young, ambitious, looking to make a name for himself in the territory. She was beautiful and utterly trapped. He convinced himself that what grew between them was love, but it was more accurately described as proximity and a woman who had no actual choice in the matter." Thomas listened without interrupting, his posture open and attentive. "When I was born, I was the physical proof of their relationship. Too Apache to be acceptable in military society, too American to be accepted in tribal communities. My father wanted to make me into something acceptable, something that fit into one category or another. My mother wanted me to survive. Those were often contradictory goals." Catherine closed the notebook, setting it aside with careful deliberation. "When I was 12, my father was transferred. My mother refused to go, refused to leave the territory. She said she'd breathed this air too long to breathe anything else. She said she wanted to die where she came from. My father had her choice: come with him or accept that her daughter would be raised in the white world without her influence. My mother made her choice. She stayed with relatives in the hills. My father took me east to the Arizona territory, to a post where people didn't know our history, where he could try to transform me into something more acceptable. That must have been difficult," Thomas said carefully. "Losing your mother like that." "It was," Catherine said, "but not in the way he expected. He thought I would grieve the separation and eventually come to appreciate being raised in civilized society. Instead, I spent 8 years feeling like I was betraying my mother by staying away. My father tried to teach me to be a lady, to care about things he valued. But my mother had raised me for the first 12 years, and she taught me something more fundamental than manners or expectations. She taught me to survive, to value my own strength, to never accept less than I deserved just because someone else demanded it." Catherine turned to look at Thomas directly. "When I was 20, my father died. I inherited this land, which he'd purchased but never spent much time on. Most people in his social circles suggested I sell it, find a respectable marriage, disappear into someone else's life. But my mother's voice was louder than all of theirs combined. She was telling me to stay, to build something that was mine, to prove that a woman could do it. So I did." "You came back to the territory," Thomas said, understanding the significance. "I came back to the territory," Catherine confirmed. "I came to this ranch and I started building. I didn't expect to ever see my mother again. She'd never left the hills, and I was committed to the ranch. But about 10 years after I arrived, she came to find me. Just appeared one day, older but unmistakably the woman who'd raised me. She didn't stay long, a few weeks, enough time to see what I'd built and to tell me she was proud. She said I'd understood her lessons better than she'd dared hope, that I'd become everything she'd hoped I would be when I was born." "Did she come back again?" Thomas asked. "Once more," Catherine said. "About 5 years ago. She was sicker by then, moved more slowly. She stayed longer, and we talked more than we had the first time. She told me something I didn't understand at the time. She said the saddest thing she'd ever witnessed was watching a strong woman choose loneliness to protect herself from the possibility of pain. She said she understood it, but she said it was a choice that cost more than it saved." Catherine's voice had become quieter, each word requiring more effort to speak. "She told me that strength wasn't about never being hurt. It was about being brave enough to let someone close, even knowing they might disappoint you. She said I had confused protection with survival, and that the two weren't the same thing. When she left, I thought she was wrong. I thought her mistakes with my father had blinded her to the wisdom of protecting yourself. And now," Thomas asked gently, "now I understand that she was talking about you," Catherine said. Or rather, about the possibility of someone like you. About making a choice to trust before you have absolute certainty that trust is warranted. Thomas reached over and took her hand, his touch gentle and warm. I'm not asking for certainty. I'm not asking for you to transform into something you're not. I'm asking for a chance to see if there's something possible between us beyond work and convenience. I'm terrified, Catherine said, and the admission felt like setting down a weight she'd been carrying for years. I know, Thomas said, but fear and courage are not opposites. Courage is acting despite the fear. Your mother understood that. I think you do too, underneath everything. Catherine didn't respond immediately. Instead, she sat with the weight of the conversation, with the vulnerability she'd exposed, with the choice that was now clearly before her. She could retreat, could push him away, could return to the solitude that was familiar. Or she could do what her mother had asked her to do decades ago. She could be brave enough to let someone matter. My mother died 3 years ago, Catherine said finally. I didn't see her again after she left that last time. I received word that she'd passed peacefully in the hills, surrounded by her people. She was 67 years old. The letter said she'd spoken of me at the end, had said she was proud of me. But I've always wondered if she knew whether I understood her final lesson. If she knew whether I'd figured out that solitude and strength weren't the same thing. Maybe it's not too late to figure that out, Thomas said. With me, if you're willing. Catherine looked at their joined hands, at the simple gesture of connection that she'd rejected from so many people for so many years. Then she looked at his face, at the steadiness and kindness in his expression, at the evidence of his integrity written in every decision he made. I'm willing to try, she said, not because I'm certain, but because staying silent feels like betraying everything my mother tried to teach me. The autumn of that year carried a different quality than previous autumns Catherine had known. The seasons had always marked transition for her, time to prepare for winter, time to assess the year's productivity, time to make decisions about the next cycle. But this year, the approaching season felt like it might bring something more significant than weather or livestock management. There was an anticipation in her chest that she still didn't entirely trust, a sensation that something fundamental was about to shift. Thomas and Catherine had developed new patterns over the summer. Their relationship remained primarily built on work and companionship, but there was an intimacy that had developed through her willingness to let him see her vulnerabilities. He knew about her mother now, about the complicated inheritance of strength and loneliness that had shaped her. He'd responded not with pity or attempts to fix her, but simply by staying, by continuing to work, by being present in a way that didn't demand she become something different than who she was. In late September, as the temperature began to cool and the first hints of the coming season appeared in subtle shifts of light and air, Thomas asked her to ride out to the northern reaches of her property. It was an unusual request. They worked in different areas depending on what needed attention, and the northern boundary didn't currently require maintenance. But Catherine had learned that Thomas often had reasons for his suggestions that weren't immediately obvious. They rode for several hours, moving deeper into territory that Catherine rarely visited during the productive seasons. The landscape became rougher, less suited to ranching, more aligned with the wild desert that surrounded her property. Eventually, they reached a ridge that overlooked a vast expanse of land, rolling hills, sparse vegetation, rock formations that had been shaped by centuries of wind and weather. Thomas dismounted and gestured for Catherine to do the same. They stood together, looking out at the landscape. "Do you know this area?" he asked. "Barely," Catherine said. "It's not productive land. I've never had reason to spend much time here. I came up here a few weeks ago," Thomas said, "just to explore, to understand the full scope of what you own. And I was thinking about something your mother told you, about strength and vulnerability, about the cost of choosing solitude over connection." Catherine waited, understanding there was something he was leading toward. "I was thinking about what it would look like to build something different here," he continued, "something separate from the main ranch, but connected to it, A place that could be ours, not mine and yours, but ours together. I've been thinking about asking you to marry me, and I wanted to offer you the choice of where we'd build that life. On the established ranch where you've already proven yourself, or on this new land where we could build something from the beginning. Catherine's breath caught. Marriage was a concept she'd categorically rejected for so long that hearing it spoken aloud felt almost surreal. "I'm not asking you to answer now," Thomas continued. "I'm asking you to think about it, to consider what it might look like to choose partnership instead of solitude. Not because you need to be rescued or because you're incomplete alone, but because you want to share your life with someone who sees your strength and respects it." They stood in silence for a long time, looking out at the untamed landscape. Catherine's mind was moving too quickly to catch all the thoughts, fear and hope and uncertainty and desire all tangled together. "I need to think," she said finally. "This is significant." "I know," Thomas said. "Take your time." They rode back to the ranch, but the world felt different, charged with possibility and consequence. Catherine found herself unable to focus on routine tasks. Her mind kept returning to the image of that ridge, to the idea of building something new, to the terrifying prospect of committing her life to someone else. She tried to work through her anxiety the way she always did, through physical labor. She threw herself into the autumn preparations, moving more intensely than usual, as if exhaustion could quiet the warring thoughts in her head. Thomas recognized what she was doing and didn't interfere, simply working beside her in steady companionship. It was 3 weeks later when the crisis arrived, the kind of crisis that was designed to test everything Catherine had been wrestling with. A man arrived at her ranch on a day when Thomas was in town getting supplies. He rode up to the house with purpose, a thin man with hard eyes and a star pinned to his chest. A territorial marshal, by the look of his bearing and equipment, Catherine Whitmore. He asked when she came to the door. "That's correct," she said, her hand resting on the doorframe, suddenly aware of how isolated her ranch was. "How far removed from town and help?" "I'm Marshal Davies, out of Phoenix. I'm here regarding allegations that have been made against you. There's a man in town, Marcus Thorne from New Mexico, who's filed a formal complaint. He's claiming that you deliberately abandoned him in the desert 7 years ago, left him there without supplies or knowledge of his location with the intent to cause him serious harm." Catherine's mind immediately went to that incident. The way Thorne had persisted despite her clear rejection. The way she'd left him in the desert as a lesson, though she'd left him with a canteen and accurate directions. "He's lying," Catherine said flatly. "He came here uninvited, persisted in courting despite being told to leave. I took him on a ride to show him the land and left him with water and directions to town. He arrived back safely. He's claiming he could have died," the marshal said. "That you deliberately tried to punish him for romantic interest." Several other men have come forward with similar stories. Cavalry officers, wealthy ranchers, all claiming you've treated them with hostility and refused reasonable courtship attempts. "I've refused unreasonable courtship attempts," Catherine said coldly. "I'm not required to accept romantic advances from anyone. That's not a crime." "No, ma'am, it's not," the marshal agreed. "But the way you've handled the rejections concerns some important people. They're suggesting that your behavior indicates you're unstable, possibly dangerous. They're suggesting that a woman with your background, mixed race, raised partially by Apache, living alone, behaving aggressively toward men, shouldn't be permitted to own significant property or operate a ranch." The words hung in the air between them like poison. "You're here because some wealthy men are embarrassed that I rejected them?" Catherine asked, her voice sharp as broken glass. "I'm here because they've filed formal complaints." "I need to investigate," the marshal said. "I need to hear your side of what happened with each of these incidents." Catherine recognized what was happening. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. About men who felt humiliated by her refusal to accept their advances, using whatever systems they could manipulate to retaliate. It was the same dynamic that had destroyed her mother's options, that had shaped her childhood, that had driven her to build her life in solitude. "I want a lawyer," Catherine said. "I want this documented, and I want you to tell those men that they can file whatever complaints they want, but they will not succeed in taking my land or my life." The marshal looked at her with something that might have been respect, though she doubted it. "That's your right. I'll need to file a report. Depending on what develops, you may need to appear before a territorial judge." He left before Thomas returned from town. Catherine considered not telling him, but understood immediately that was not an option. This was something that would affect him, as much as it affected her. When Thomas arrived, she explained everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. "They're trying to use the systems to punish you for having autonomy," he said when she finished. "That's what this is about." "I know," Catherine said. "And I know that even if I prevail in court, even if I prove that my actions were justified, there will be others. There will always be men who feel entitled to women who reject them, and there will always be systems that support their sense of entitlement." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ranch they'd been building together. "I want to marry you," he said, not turning around. "Not because this makes it more urgent, but because it's still true. And I want you to know that I'm not asking you to be less fierce, less independent, less willing to defend your own boundaries. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you while you do those things. Not to protect you from the world, but to make it clear that you don't have to face it alone." Catherine felt something break open inside her chest. If we marry, it might make things worse legally. It might complicate property ownership or give them ammunition to claim I was being influenced. It might, Thomas agreed. But the alternative is letting them win by scaring you into isolation. And I don't think that's something your mother would have wanted for you. Catherine stood and walked to him. She took his hand and placed it over her heart. "Yes," she said. "Yes to marriage. Yes to building something new on that ridge. Yes to choosing partnership instead of running from it. The territorial court system," Catherine quickly learned, was not designed to protect the rights of women like her. It was designed to protect the interests of powerful men, with women's autonomy existing only insofar as it didn't threaten male authority or comfort. The hearing was scheduled for mid-November in Phoenix, requiring Catherine to leave her ranch for several days and appear before a judge whose reputation suggested he had strong opinions about women who lived independently. The night before they were scheduled to leave for Phoenix, Catherine and Thomas sat on the porch of the ranch house. The autumn was deepening into winter, the air carrying that particular chill that promised harder cold to come. Catherine had spent the day ensuring the ranch could function without her presence, instructing her new hired hand, a capable young man named Samuel, who'd arrived in September, on the specific tasks that needed attention. "I'm not going to win," Catherine said, without preamble. "I know how these things work. I've watched them my entire life. Wealthy men have influence. They have friends in positions of power. I'm a woman of mixed heritage who's rejected them, and that's a combination the system doesn't favor." Thomas didn't argue or offer empty reassurance. Instead, he took her hand. "What do you want to happen?" "I want to keep my land," Catherine said. "That's the fundamental thing. I can survive legal challenges, legal complications, even public judgment. But if I lose the ranch, if they decide that a woman like me isn't fit to own property, I lose everything my father and I built. I lose the place where my mother came to find me. I lose the evidence that I survived on my terms. Then we fight for it," Thomas said simply. "Not because we're certain to win, but because the alternative is accepting that their version of the world is correct." Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder. "My mother asked me to be brave, to choose connection instead of solitude. But she didn't tell me that connection meant having someone to stand with when everything became difficult. I don't know if I'm grateful for that or angry at her for leaving it out. Probably both," Thomas said. "Most true things are both." The journey to Phoenix took 2 full days of hard riding. Catherine and Thomas traveled together, stopping only when the horses needed rest. The landscape shifted as they moved south, the high desert giving way to lower elevations, the sparse vegetation becoming slightly more abundant, the air becoming warmer. By the time they reached Phoenix, Catherine felt as though they'd traveled between different worlds. Phoenix was a city in transition, no longer a town but not yet truly a city, caught between what it had been and what it was becoming. The territorial courthouse was an impressive structure, designed to project authority and permanence. Catherine stood before it with Thomas at her side and felt the full weight of what she was about to face. The hearing room was filled with people. Catherine recognized some of them. Marcus Thorne was there, looking both triumphant and wounded, in the way men often did when their pride had been hurt and they'd convinced themselves it was injustice. Several cavalry officers she'd rejected over the years. Edmund Price from the general store, who surprised her by nodding in acknowledgement. A gesture of support that she appreciated but which would likely carry no weight with the judge. Judge Harrison was an older man with the kind of face that had been shaped by decades of making decisions that affected other people's lives. He studied Catherine with an expression that seemed to contain both curiosity and something that might have been disdain. "Miss Whitmore," he began, "you've been accused of deliberately abandoning Mr. Thorne in the desert with the intention of causing him harm, of behaving aggressively and with hostility toward multiple men who made advances toward you. The complainants suggest that your behavior indicates an instability that makes you unfit to manage significant property holdings. How do you respond to these allegations?" Catherine stood. She'd spent the night before memorizing what she wanted to say, but as she stood to speak, she realized the words weren't coming from memory. They were coming from a place deeper than that, from the accumulation of every choice she'd made. Every time she'd refused to be less than herself. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "these men came to my property uninvited. When I made clear I had no interest in romantic involvement with them, they continued to press their advances. I responded by refusing them. That's not instability. That's boundary setting. That's self-protection. You claim you left Mr. Thorne in the desert as a form of teaching," the judge said, reading from the documentation in front of him. "I left Mr. Thorne in the desert with a canteen of water and accurate directions to town," Catherine corrected. "He was an adult man in daylight hours with resources. If he chose to interpret that as punishment rather than a clear statement that his presence was no longer welcome, that reflects his interpretation, not my intention." One of the cavalry officers stood. "Your Honor, respectfully, a woman living alone, the daughter of an Apache and a military officer, refusing respectable advances from white men. This suggests she's been influenced by tribal values that don't align with civilized society. It suggests she may be a danger to herself and potentially others." The blatancy of the racism in the statement was almost stunning. The judge didn't dismiss it outright, which told Catherine everything she needed to know about what she was actually facing. "My Apache heritage is not a character flaw," Catherine said, her voice cutting through the courtroom. "My mother was a survivor of forced capture and non-consensual relationship. Everything I've built on my ranch, my independence, my refusal to accept what isn't offered freely, my commitment to making my own choices, comes directly from her example. Those values have made me capable of managing significant property, of running a successful operation, of surviving in territory that breaks most people. Those values are not a disease. They're a strength." She turned to address the judge directly. "Your Honor, these men want me removed from my property because I had the audacity to have standards and boundaries they didn't respect. That's not a legal matter. That's a dispute between men who feel rejected and a woman who believes she deserves to choose. If the legal system allows men to strip women of their property rights because those women won't accept their romantic advances, then the legal system is broken, and I'd rather live outside of it than be subject to it." The room was silent. Thomas squeezed her hand, and Catherine understood that she might have just made things worse. Defiance, even when justified, could backfire in courtrooms designed to punish autonomy. Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair and studied Catherine for a long moment. Miss Whitmore, you're eloquent and apparently unapologetic about your behavior. That presents a problem for the complainants, because it's very difficult to prove that a woman acting in her own self-interest is acting in violation of any law. Mr. Thorne was returned safely to town. The cavalry officers admit they persisted, despite clear rejection. No one can claim actual injury beyond wounded pride. He paused, and Catherine waited for the but that she was certain was coming, however. He continued, I am troubled by the suggestion that a woman of your background is managing significant property. The territory has long tradition of ensuring that valuable resources are held by those deemed capable of managing them properly. There are questions about whether someone of mixed heritage has the judgment and stability necessary for such responsibility. Your Honor, a new voice called from the back of the courtroom. An older man stood, someone Catherine didn't immediately recognize. If I may address the court, I'm Attorney Vincent Morrison, and I represent Miss Whitmore's interests in this matter. Catherine glanced at Thomas, confused. She hadn't hired an attorney. Thomas squeezed her hand again, and she understood that he had without asking her permission. He'd anticipated this might be necessary and taken action. Miss Whitmore has been managing her property successfully for 14 years, Morrison continued, stepping forward with documentation in hand. She has the highest productivity ratings of any ranch in the territory. Her water management system is innovative and effective. Her business practices are sound. The only question before this court should be whether her ancestry makes her incapable of competent management. And if that's the question the court is prepared to answer, then the court is explicitly stating that property rights are dependent on racial heritage rather than capability. I suspect the territory's higher courts, let alone federal courts, would find that reasoning troubling. It was a brilliant move, threatening to escalate the case, to make the judge's potential decision into something that would be documented and potentially reviewed by higher authority. Judge Harrison's expression hardened. That's an inappropriate implication, Counselor, is it? Morrison asked mildly. I'm simply pointing out that Miss Whitmore's capability to manage her property is independent of her heritage. If the court finds otherwise, the court is making a racially based determination of property rights, which has implications well beyond this single case. The courtroom was entirely silent now. Catherine could see the calculations happening behind the judge's eyes, weighing the potential trouble of denying her case against the certainty of it being challenged and potentially overturned. Find, the judge said finally, that there is insufficient evidence to strip Miss Whitmore of her property holdings based on the claims presented. However, I want to make clear that this court views her behavior as irregular and her lifestyle as questionable. I would strongly suggest she consider a more conventional path. The hearing is concluded. Catherine felt Thomas's hand tighten around hers. It wasn't a victory in the way she would have wished for one. The judge's language was still dismissive, still questioning her autonomy. But it was a victory nonetheless. She'd keep her land. She'd keep her choices. As they left the courtroom, Edmund Price approached them. I wasn't sure if I should have come, he said, but your mother was always kind to me, and I thought she'd want someone here who believed in you. Catherine nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. The woman who'd raised her, the woman she'd learned so much from but had been separated from by circumstance and choice, had apparently created enough goodwill in the territory that even years after her death, it still mattered. That evening in the hotel room in Phoenix, Thomas pulled a small box from his pack. Inside was a ring, simple silver with a single Apache design etched into the band. I had this made while you were preparing your testimony, he said. I wanted something that honored who you are. Will you marry me, Catherine? Not because the court validated your right to exist independently, but because I choose you, and I want the world to know that choice. Catherine looked at the ring, at Thomas, at the man who'd waited through winter, who'd stood beside her through crisis, who'd hired an attorney without being asked and trusted that she was capable of handling herself in a courtroom. Yes, she said, Yes to the ring. Yes to marriage. Yes to choosing partnership when I could have chosen solitude. My mother was right about courage. Winter came early that year, as if the territory itself wanted to mark the significance of the changes unfolding on Catherine's ranch. The temperature dropped in November. Snow began to fall by mid-December, and by the time the new year arrived, the landscape had transformed into something crystalline and stark. Most people would have seen it as a hardship, the weather that made work difficult and resources scarce. But Catherine, standing on the porch of her ranch house with Thomas beside her, saw it as a testing ground. They'd chosen to marry during a brief break in the weather in late December. Not in town, not in the church in Redemption Valley. Instead, they'd invited a small group: Edmund Price, Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store in town, Samuel the hired hand, and 2 members of Catherine's mother's tribe who'd come north specifically for the ceremony. A local reverend had agreed to perform the service, though Catherine suspected he was more motivated by the potential scandal of refusing than by any genuine support for her choices. The ceremony took place in the ranch house, in front of the fireplace where Catherine had spent so many years alone, watching flames and thinking about futures that seemed impossible. Thomas wore the only formal clothes he owned, a suit slightly too small, pressed carefully the night before. Catherine wore a dress that wasn't white, a choice that had raised eyebrows in town, but which felt more honest than pretending to be a virginal bride. When she was a woman in her 30s, who'd spent 14 years building a life on her own terms, when the Reverend asked if Catherine took Thomas to be her husband, she'd answered clearly and without hesitation. When he asked Thomas, there was a moment of silence, so brief most people wouldn't have noticed, where Catherine saw something cross his face. Not doubt exactly, but something like the weight of understanding what he was promising, what he was choosing, what it meant to commit to a woman who would never be small or manageable or conventional. Then he said yes, and the moment passed. The marriage itself changed nothing about the immediate work that needed doing, and everything about the texture of the work. Thomas moved into Catherine's room, and the small bed that had always seemed adequate suddenly felt confined. They adapted. They learned each other's sleeping patterns and preferences. They learned how to share space in ways that Catherine had never imagined she would need to learn. By mid-January, when the snow was at its deepest, they began planning the structure that would go on the northern ridge. Thomas had spent weeks in the fall surveying the land, understanding the water flow, the wind patterns, the topography that would make building either easy or nearly impossible. He'd brought back detailed sketches, not formal architectural drawings, but careful observations translated into line and notation that made sense to anyone who understood ranch building. The foundation needs to be on the northern slope, he explained one evening as they sat by the fire, documents spread across their laps. If we build on the ridge itself, we'll have exposure to wind from both directions. We'll lose heat through the structure. But here, he pointed to a location that was slightly lower, sheltered by the natural curve of the land. We can use the terrain to our advantage. We'll have wind protection, water drainage, and southern exposure for warmth. Catherine studied the drawings. She'd been reading about architecture and building since she was young, had studied the decisions her father had made, and analyzed why they worked or didn't work. She'd built much of her own ranch house through observation and trial. But this was different. This was Thomas showing her something he'd learned, inviting her into his knowledge rather than simply executing her vision. "You've thought about this carefully," she said. "I have," Thomas agreed, "because I want it to be right. Not just functional, but right. A place where we could stay through any weather, any season. A place that feels like home from the first moment." They spread the planning across the winter months. While the snow made work on the ridge impossible, they worked in the warmth of the house. Thomas drew more detailed plans. Catherine consulted her books on building materials and techniques. They argued about storage space and window placement and whether they could justify the expense of importing quality lumber or whether they should work with local stone and timber. It was the kind of argument that made Catherine realize how different marriage was from the partnership she'd imagined. She'd thought it would be about compromise, about each person giving up half of what they wanted to arrive at a middle ground. But what was actually happening was more complex. They were each bringing their full selves to the conversation, full opinions and observations and preferences. And somehow, from that collision of perspectives, something better was emerging than either of them would have created alone. In February, when the worst of the snow began to break, they rode out to the ridge with a surveyor from town. A formal measurement of the land, a staking of the boundaries, a commitment made official and documented. The surveyor was a man named Harrison, who'd known Catherine's father and regarded her with the kind of respect that came from long understanding. "This is good land," he said, looking around at the exposed ridge with its sweeping views. "Harsh but good. You've chosen the right place." By March, the snow had mostly melted, and they began the actual work of building. Thomas hired 2 additional workers, men he'd worked with before and trusted. The materials arrived in stages: lumber from a mill 50 miles south, stone from a quarry that had been used for several territorial buildings. The foundation was dug, the posts set, the frame began to rise. Catherine worked alongside the men, something that raised eyebrows among the townspeople, but which she and Thomas had simply decided together would happen. She was strong, capable, and she'd been building structures on her land for 14 years. The fact that she was now wearing a wedding ring didn't change her competence. It was Samuel, her hired hand, who first suggested the additional structure. "You've got good water access on that northern ridge," he said one afternoon as they were working. "Have you considered doing anything with it? A small structure for equipment storage or maybe a workshop space? The main house is going to be beautiful. But if you're planning to expand operations, which seems like where this is heading, you'll need somewhere to work that isn't the main living space." Catherine and Thomas exchanged glances. It was the kind of practical observation that made her realize how much having capable people around actually changed what was possible. "We could build a separate structure," Thomas said thoughtfully. "Something modest but well-designed. A workshop and storage that could also serve as shelter if weather turned bad while we were out working the land." What followed was an expansion of the plan that neither of them had initially envisioned. Instead of one structure, they would build 2, the main house for living and a second building for work and storage. It would require more resources, more time, more labor. It would also create something more substantial, more permanent, more clearly reflecting that this was a partnership that would generate new opportunities rather than simply consolidating what already existed. By late April, the main house structure was taking clear form. Walls were going up, the roof frame was being positioned. Catherine could walk through the space and imagine where the kitchen would be, where they'd sleep, where they'd sit by the fire on winter nights. It was beginning to feel real in a way that sketches on paper never quite had. One afternoon, as she was standing in what would be the main room, looking out at the windows they'd positioned to capture views and light, Thomas came to find her. "I wanted to show you something," he said, pulling a small item from his pocket. It was a piece of wood, perhaps 4 inches long, carved with careful attention. At one end was a simple design, an Apache pattern worked into the surface. At the other end was a different pattern, something that looked vaguely like ranch brands or territorial markers. "I've been working on this for months," Thomas said, "trying to figure out how to do it justice. I want to embed this in the main doorframe when we finish the house. A piece that honors both your heritage and your work. A piece that says this is a place where both of those things matter." Catherine took the carved piece and turned it over in her hands. The work was delicate and precise, clearly done by someone who understood both traditions well enough to blend them without appropriation or distortion. It was beautiful, and it was meaningful, and it was exactly what she needed to see. "Thank you," she said, and heard in her own voice the echo of her mother's teachings about vulnerability and connection. "For understanding what matters to me, for building it into what we're creating. That's what partnership means," Thomas said. understanding what matters to the other person, making space for it, letting it shape what we build together. By the time late spring arrived, the main house was weather-tight and livable. They'd moved in on a warm day in May, walking through the door, not yet finished with its embedded carving, but soon to be, and standing together in the space they'd planned and built. The windows framed views of the territory in every direction. The fireplace was functional. The kitchen had space for cooking and preservation. The bedroom was small but warm, and the bed they'd brought from Catherine's original house seemed to fit perfectly into the space. It wasn't finished. There were details to complete, furniture to gather, systems to establish. But it was alive in a way the original ranch house had never quite been, because it had been built by two people who chose to be there, rather than by one person who was there out of necessity and habit. That evening, they sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sunset. And Catherine realized that this particular moment, this particular piece, was what her mother had been trying to describe when she talked about courage and connection. It wasn't the absence of risk. It was the willingness to take risk because something mattered more than safety. The summer that followed the completion of their new home brought unexpected visitors to the territory. Word had spread through the ranching communities about the ridge property and the way it had been built, not through conquest or inheritance, but through collaboration and careful planning. People came to see what Catherine and Thomas had created, ostensibly to purchase supplies or seek work, but really out of curiosity about the woman who'd refused to be diminished by the court system and the man who'd stood beside her. Edmund Price brought news from town. There was a journalist from back east who was traveling through the territory, collecting stories about frontier life. He wanted to write about Catherine, about her ranch, her mother's legacy, her victory in court. Edmund seemed to think it was an opportunity. "He's respectable," Edmund said, as he and Catherine sat on the porch of the original ranch house, which now served primarily as storage and workspace. "Writes for a major publication. He's interested in stories about people building meaningful lives in difficult circumstances. He sees you as important to document." Catherine's immediate instinct was to refuse. Publicity was attention, and attention brought scrutiny and complication. But she found herself considering it differently now, not through the lens of self-protection, but through the lens of what such a story might mean, what it might communicate to other women, what it might establish as precedent. "Let me talk to Thomas," she said finally. That evening they discussed it at length. Thomas listened to her concerns about privacy and intrusion, about having her life made into a narrative for consumption by people who didn't know her. But he also pointed out what she already understood on some level. "Your mother came back to see what you'd built," he said. That was a kind of recognition. This would be another kind. Not as important as hers, but still valuable. It would put on record that a woman of mixed heritage could own land, could manage it successfully, could build a life that mattered. Catherine agreed to the interview with conditions. The journalist, a man named Robert Crawford, would visit for 3 days. He could observe the work, talk to her and Thomas, see the ranch and the new house on the ridge. But he couldn't interview her in town or involve Edmund Price in any way, except as a source of basic information. The story would be Catherine's, told on her terms. Crawford arrived in late June, traveling from Redemption Valley with Edmund as his guide. He was younger than Catherine expected, perhaps 40, with the appearance of someone who'd spent more time with books than with outdoor labor, but whose eyes suggested genuine intelligence and curiosity. Thomas went out to greet him while Catherine continued working. She decided that she would not alter her routine because of his presence. If he wanted to see what her life was actually like, he would see it. It took Crawford 2 hours of observation before he asked his first substantive question. He was standing with Catherine in the south pasture, where she was checking on cattle that had recently given birth. The calves were healthy and strong, already moving with the confidence of animals that had learned their land and were trusted by their mothers. "How did you learn to do this?" he asked. "The ranching, the animal husbandry, the business management. None of it is knowledge that comes naturally to most people. Observation, Catherine said, not pausing in her work. Documentation. Reading everything I could find about ranching practices. Talking to people who were willing to talk to me, and trial and error. A lot of trial and error. When you're alone, you can't afford to make mistakes repeatedly, so you learn to learn carefully. Each mistake becomes a lesson instead of just a mistake. Your father taught you? Some, but not as much as you might think. My father built this ranch, but he wasn't a natural rancher. He was a military officer who decided to become a rancher. He was competent, but he was always approaching it as a problem to solve, rather than something that was woven into his understanding of the world. My mother's people had lived off this land for generations. That understanding was in her blood, but she was taken from her life so that knowledge couldn't be passed on to me directly. Instead, it came to me through her values, her insistence that I learn to survive, to trust my own judgment, to never accept diminishment. That's what I inherited from her. Crawford was quiet, writing notes in a small journal he carried. And Thomas? How did he fit into all of this? He arrived when I'd been alone for 14 years, Catherine said. I'd built something solid, something that worked. I'd convinced myself that solitude was strength. He showed me that having chosen solitude, I now had to choose connection. That's a different kind of courage. Solitude is easy once you've decided you don't need anyone. Connection requires ongoing choice, ongoing vulnerability. That's harder. Over the 3 days of Crawford's visit, he observed everything. He saw Catherine and Thomas working together on ranch tasks. He saw them planning an expansion to the cattle operation. He visited the ridge property and examined the house they'd built. He talked to Samuel, who spoke about Catherine's competence with genuine respect. He even made the ride into Redemption Valley and interviewed Edmund Price and some of the townspeople about their perceptions of Catherine and how they'd changed over the years. On his final evening, Crawford sat with both Catherine and Thomas on the porch of the ridge house. The sunset painting the territory in shades of gold and crimson. I want to be honest with you, he said. When I set out to write this story, I had one narrative in mind. A woman victimized by circumstance, surviving against the odds. The kind of story that would appeal to readers who like to feel sympathetic and moved by hardship overcome. But what I've encountered here is different. You're not a victim, Catherine. You're a woman who made choices and continued making them. Some of those choices were made in solitude. Some were made with Thomas. But they were always yours. That's a harder story to tell because it doesn't fit easily into the narrative frameworks most people expect. Are you still going to write it? Catherine asked. I am, Crawford said. But I'm going to write the true story. The one about a woman who refused to accept limitation, who built something substantial on her own terms, and who chose partnership not out of necessity, but because she recognized its value. The one about a man who recognized strength and respected it, rather than trying to diminish it. The one about what's possible when people build together, rather than trying to save each other. That story matters more, I think. It's more useful. After Crawford left the next morning, Catherine felt something settle in her chest. There was no guarantee that the article would be published, or that it would be received as Crawford intended. But she'd told her truth to someone who'd had the capacity to listen to it without needing to reshape it into something more comfortable. By late summer, word came that Crawford's article had been published in a major Eastern magazine. Copies made their way west slowly, but eventually Edmund Price obtained one and brought it to the ranch. The headline read, "A Woman Who Could Not Be Broken, the story of Catherine Whitmore and the partnership that changed everything." Catherine read it alone, sitting on the porch of the ridge house. Crawford had captured something essential, not the melodrama of struggle, but the quiet power of persistence. He'd written about her mother and the legacy of strength. He'd written about her decision to remain on her land. He'd written about Thomas in a way that honored his role without making him the hero of the story. But most importantly, he'd written about her choice to accept partnership. He'd framed it not as a man saving a woman, but as two people recognizing in each other the capacity to build something neither could build alone. By autumn, Catherine began receiving letters. Women from back east, from towns throughout the territory, from places she'd never heard of. They wrote about reading the article and finding in it permission to make choices they'd been afraid to make. A woman in Kansas wrote that she'd shown it to her husband to explain why she needed to keep her property in her own name despite marriage. A woman in Colorado wrote that she'd used the article in a conversation with her father about attending university. A young woman in Arizona wrote simply that she'd read about Catherine and understood, for the first time, that her strength wasn't a shameful thing that needed to be hidden. Catherine compiled the letters and showed them to Thomas one winter evening as they sat by their fireplace. "I didn't set out to change anything," she said. "I was just trying to survive and then to build." But Crawford's story did something I didn't anticipate. It gave other people permission to imagine their own possibilities. "That's what happens when you live with integrity," Thomas said. "When you refuse to accept limitation, not out of rebellion, but out of genuine belief that you deserve more. Other people see that and recognize it in themselves." Catherine thought about her mother, who taught her about strength, but had lived most of her life without the opportunity to fully claim her own power. She thought about all the women who'd lived and died without the option to refuse, to choose, to build. And she understood that every choice she'd made, every boundary she'd maintained, every time she'd said no to a diminished version of herself, all of it mattered in ways that extended far beyond her own life. The letters continued to arrive through the winter. Catherine kept them all, organized them carefully, and eventually brought them to Crawford when he passed through the territory again the following spring. He was already planning a follow-up article about the response to the first one, about what happened when people discovered that they had options they hadn't known existed. 5 years after Crawford's article first circulated, Catherine stood on the ridge overlooking her land and understood that her life had become something larger than she'd ever imagined when she was a young woman refusing cavalry officers and territorial ranches. The ranch had expanded significantly, not through acquisition of additional property, but through improved productivity and strategic partnerships with other operations. The workshop building had evolved into something more substantial, a place where other ranchers came to consult on water management and sustainable grazing practices. Catherine had become, almost without intending it, an authority on making difficult land productive. But more significant than the practical expansion was the number of women who now worked the territory. Some had come directly because of Catherine's story, had written to her asking for advice or guidance. Others had simply been inspired by the knowledge that a woman could own land, could refuse to diminish herself, could build something substantial on her own terms. There were now 3 other women ranchers within 100 miles, each building something different, but each claiming Catherine as inspiration or proof of concept. Thomas had become something different too. What had begun as manual labor on Catherine's ranch had evolved into a position of genuine authority. He managed day-to-day operations, made decisions about resource allocation, and was consulted on strategic planning. But more importantly, he'd begun to mentor the young men who came through looking for work. He taught them not just the skills of ranching, but a philosophy of work, that every task mattered, that the quality of how you did something reflected who you were, that respecting the people you worked with was as important as respecting the land. It was on a warm afternoon in September when the unexpected visitor arrived. An older woman traveling alone, riding a horse that was well cared for, but clearly belonging to someone who'd ridden far. Catherine was in the south pasture checking on water sources when she saw Thomas approaching on horseback, a guest riding beside him, something in the way the woman sat her horse, in the angle of her shoulders and the way her hair was braided, sent a shock of recognition through Catherine before her conscious mind had time to process details. Catherine dismounted and walked forward slowly, trying to understand what she was seeing. The woman dismounted as well, and as she got closer, the resemblance became unmistakable. She had Catherine's height, Catherine's bearing, Catherine's eyes, with that same disconcerting amber flecking. "I'm not your mother," the woman said before Catherine could speak, "though I suppose I could have been in a different timeline. I'm her sister, your aunt. My name is Sarah Whitmore, though I was born running Fox and have carried other names since then." Catherine found her voice. "My mother never mentioned having a sister. She had many reasons not to," Sarah said. Her accent was influenced by years with the people, but she spoke English clearly. "We were separated when she was taken. She didn't know if I'd survived or where I'd ended up. The world broke her heart with that not knowing. So she chose not to carry the hope of reunion. It was a kind of mercy to herself. They moved to the house, and Thomas, with remarkable sensitivity, excused himself to handle ranch business, leaving Catherine and her aunt to talk. They sat on the porch of the Ridge House, looking out at the territory, and Sarah told her story. She had survived the same raid that had taken Catherine's mother, had been raised by the people, had lived through reservation confinement, had eventually escaped into the territory as an adult, and built a life of her own. For decades, she hadn't known her sister survived, hadn't known about Catherine's existence. But 5 years ago, a traveling merchant had brought her a copy of Crawford's article, and she'd recognized in Catherine's description of her mother the sister she'd lost before she ever really knew her. "I couldn't come immediately," Sarah said. "There were obligations, people depending on me. But I promised myself that I would come, that I would see what my sister had created, that I would tell her that strength runs in our blood, that what she's built isn't an exception or a miracle, it's an inheritance." Catherine felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying since childhood without fully understanding what it was. The knowledge that her strength had no place in the world she'd been born into, that it was anomalous and dangerous and wrong. Suddenly, there was her aunt sitting across from her, embodying the exact same qualities, having built an entire life on the same refusal to be diminished. "How long can you stay?" Catherine asked. 2 weeks, Sarah said. "I have people counting on me to return, but I wanted my niece to know that she's not alone, that what she's built matters, that her mother would be proud." Those 2 weeks transformed something in Catherine's understanding of herself. Sarah shared stories about their mother, about the Apache traditions that had been passed down through their bloodline, about the spiritual practices that had sustained women through centuries of survival and resistance. She showed Catherine rituals and songs that their mother had taught her, knowledge that had been deliberately preserved to pass on to descendants. Catherine's mother had never shared these things directly, perhaps couldn't, given the world she'd been forced to live in, but they'd come down through Sarah. Thomas listened to the stories with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, showing respect for traditions that were not his own. He and Sarah developed a quick rapport, bonded by their shared recognition of Catherine's significance and their mutual respect for what she'd built. On Sarah's final evening, Catherine took her to the place where her mother had always liked to sit when she visited, a point of rock that overlooked several valleys, where the air seemed clearer and the view extended to the horizon. They brought food and coffee and sat as the sun descended toward the mountains. "Your mother told me once," Sarah said, "that the greatest gift she could give you was the knowledge that you didn't have to make yourself smaller to be acceptable to the world. That if the world couldn't accept your full size, your full strength, your full self, then the problem was with the world, not with you. She lived that belief even though the world never quite accepted her. But you've taken it further. You haven't just lived it. You've built evidence that it's true, that a woman of mixed heritage can own land, that strength isn't dangerous, that partnership is possible without diminishment. I had help," Catherine said. "Thomas, Edmund Price, the people in town who testified on my behalf. My mother, even though she couldn't be here. I didn't do this alone. No one does anything important alone," Sarah said. But that doesn't make what you did any less yours. You made choices about what to refuse and what to accept. You chose Thomas, but you could have refused him. You chose to open your story to Crawford, but you could have remained silent. You chose to build on the ridge, but you could have stayed on the original ranch. Every choice matters. Every choice is still yours. When Sarah left the next morning, Catherine rode with her to the edge of her property. They didn't say much. Some conversations don't require words. But when they reached the boundary line, Sarah turned her horse and looked back at Catherine. "I'm proud to be related to you," she said simply. "I'm proud to share blood with someone who refused to break. Your mother would be too." After Sarah left, Catherine spent weeks contemplating what her aunt had told her about legacy and inheritance. She'd been so focused on building something practical, a successful ranch, a life of her own, that she hadn't fully appreciated the ways her choices rippled outward, became part of other people's calculations about what was possible. That autumn, Catherine made a decision. With Thomas's support, she began to formalize the knowledge she'd accumulated about ranching, about managing difficult land, about building structures that would last. She started hosting women who wanted to learn, offering instruction in animal husbandry, water management, basic construction. She didn't charge for this teaching. She simply opened her land and her knowledge, the way her aunt and mother had opened theirs to her. By the following spring, there were 5 women spending extended time on the ranch, learning, building capability, preparing to return to their own communities with new skills. One of them, a young Apache woman named Mary Running Bear, was the granddaughter of a woman who'd known Catherine's mother. The connection spiraled back through generations and forward into new ones, creating a lineage of knowledge and possibility. That summer, when Thomas and Catherine were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, she turned to him and spoke something she'd been contemplating for months. "I want to do something with my mother's legacy," she said. "Something more intentional. I'm thinking about establishing a fund to support women who want to purchase land. Not charity exactly, but opportunity. A way to make it harder for the world to tell women they don't belong here." Thomas smiled. "I was wondering when you'd get around to that. I have some money set aside. We could make it substantial. You've been planning for this?" Catherine asked. "I've been planning for you," Thomas said, "for whatever you decided you needed to build next. The land, the business, the teaching, all of it comes from you recognizing what was needed and having the courage to create it. I'm just making sure I'm positioned to support whatever you imagine." Catherine looked at this man she'd chosen, who'd chosen her, and understood that this too was part of the legacy. The knowledge that partnership didn't diminish her, but multiplied her capacity for impact. That strength wasn't a finite resource that had to be hoarded, but something that grew through sharing. Years later, when historians began to document the early settlement of the Arizona Territory and the women who'd built substantial lives there, Catherine Whitmore's name appeared repeatedly, not as an anomaly or an exception, but as the beginning of a pattern. The woman who'd refused to be diminished had made it possible for other women to refuse diminishment. The woman who'd chosen partnership had demonstrated that strength and connection weren't opposites. But Catherine never thought of herself as historical. She thought of herself as exactly what she'd always been, a woman who'd inherited strength from her mother and her aunt, who'd built a life on her own terms, who discovered that the most courageous choice she made wasn't solitude, but connection. A woman who'd looked at a stranger on the fence line and recognized not a threat, but a possibility. A woman who'd learned that being brave enough didn't mean being alone. It meant being willing to stand beside someone, and having them willing to stand beside you, and together building something that neither of you could have built alone. That was the true legacy. Not the ranch, or the reputation, or the historical documentation, but the understanding that passed from mother to daughter to niece to stranger to friend. The understanding that strength and vulnerability weren't opposites. That a woman could be exactly who she was and be valued for it. That no man needed to be brave enough for her. She was brave enough for herself, But having someone brave enough to stand beside her made everything possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.